Good? Okay. I don't want to block the way. You're good. Yeah, hi, my name is Lenny. Here's my long title. And shout out to Dr. Nelson Pichardo for helping me out with this project. We've been working on this for like a good solid year. Next slide for me. So my project is really complicated. As a sociology major, there are so many intersections with what it is you deal with, what you read about. And so to sum it basically up is, my project is about the intersections between gender and race, specifically masculinity, and how they interact through the sport of boxing. And my subject of this study is the first black heavyweight champion of the world, Jack Johnson. And I picked him because he was one of the premier black celebrities of the time, of the era of the early 1900s, the progressive era. And another aspect to all of what I just said is basically there's a class component to understanding what the intersections are, as well as an assimilation aspect. How do black people assimilate into the United States? Because I would argue that they're still getting pushback for a lot of the things that they do. And also, there's onto class, there is boxing was one of the primary ways that people, black men, really tried to get into the job market working. Like it's a form of work. And so all that to say, it's very complicated. And that's basically it. Could you get to the next one? Thank you. And so prior research has been about like what Jack Johnson has done in his time. He fought Jim Jeffries back in 1910, who was the heavyweight champion. And he faced a lot of pushback from white-owned media outlets. So there's this need for him, Jack Johnson, to have to struggle to get to where he was at, winning the title, actually fighting for it. And I don't think a lot of research was about what black people thought about what Jack Johnson did. And so we have, if you're a nerd like myself, we have Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, who were middle-class thinkers, black thinkers at the time, who had different ideas on how to assimilate black men into the United States, black people, essentially. And so my research is really focused on this gender strategy that Jack Johnson, I'll tell you about it later, that Jack Johnson embodied with his own actions outside of the ring, whether he was marrying white women, he was driving nice cars, he was in a nice suit, probably better than mine. And yeah, all that to say that that's where my research is really about. Also, another part of my research is about the social class, because Jack Johnson himself was relatively working class. He was the son of slaves. And these two men, even though Washington was born a slave, at the point at which Jack Johnson was a fighter, they were thoroughly middle class. They had their different understandings of how black men need to assimilate and conduct themselves, if you would, please. And so this one is basically about the state of masculinity at the time. When industrialization happened, there was a lot of people feeling alienated from their work, and so, especially white men, they really gravitated towards the sport of boxing. Historically speaking, boxing has been a working class sort of sport to really get into, and so this idea that, well, I can't really define myself as a strong farm boy, a lot of sporting clubs opened up with like boxing as the way to become masculine. And I love this picture of Teddy Roosevelt because he himself was a big proponent of boxing as like not just affirmation of your gender, but affirmation of your race. Because Roosevelt himself was a big fan of boxing. He loved it. He couldn't talk anything about it. He would tell senators, meet me outside, we're fighting. He was that type of guy. And so the moment that Jack Johnson won the title back in 1908, Roosevelt was suddenly all about, well, we need to regulate this sport of boxing. It hurts the character of our young men who see Jack Johnson beat up all other white men. And the moment that Jack Johnson lost the title, essentially, Roosevelt and men like him were like, oh, well, now boxing is where it's supposed to be. We need to see more of it. Young men need to get into it, young white men in particular. And so this is the zeitgeist of the time. And for black working class men, boxing was like one of the few jobs that you could really define yourself, as well as like controlling the narrative. Who's your manager? What you get to say to the media? It's one of the only jobs at that time period to really produce this independence. Next slide for me. And so the beginning of the title, Appropriate Blackness, it's basically this term that me and my mentor got to, where blackness is curated in a white supremacist society. And so appropriate blackness, we would argue, is just this way, how do black people define themselves within a white supremacist structure, power system? Like this particular photo right here was about, no one could beat Jack Johnson as a fighter, but he was convicted of the White Slavery Act, the Mann Act, where he transported women, white women for immoral purposes. That was the Mann Act trial. And so there's a little bit of white nationalism against Jack Johnson's depiction. The only white hope, the real last white hope going against Jack Johnson. And so appropriate blackness is just this way to assimilate, it's actually coming up next, actually. So just how do we define ourselves in a white supremacist society? Next slide for me. And these two men had different ideas on how to assimilate into society, American society. We had Booker T. Washington, who was all about working hard and just trying to work better, work harder, and then you'll slowly get those rights. And then you had Du Bois, who was more of a confrontationalist. He'll criticize all the lynchings and whatnot. And these two men, despite being on the opposite sides of the spectrum, I wouldn't say they're like morally, I wouldn't say there's like a moral, me categorizing these two men in their perspectives isn't like a moral battle per se, because a lot of working class people, and I'll show you in the next slide, sort of combine these two different elements of what these thinkers thought about, because these are middle class elements from what I found in my research. A lot of people are just worried about, trying to eat, trying to provide for their family, etc., etc. And so it's very interesting to see these men also call each other out in the newspaper. It's some real old school beef, essentially. And so could you get to the next one? And so a lot of working class people, if you could see the pictures, really adopted this style, being a sport. Essentially, a sport is a man who is very blasé about anything. You get punched in the face, it don't matter, you'll punch him back. Or they're really freewheeling with their money in terms of, I can get it, now I can spend it easily. And you see here Jack Johnson himself looking real spiffy. And I don't know if y'all can tell where his teeth are, but essentially Jack Johnson back in 1908, he had like gold teeth, so he was the originator of having a grill essentially. And so for Jack Johnson, he's the biggest person who you would call a sport. His gender strategy was just to be real spiffy, have the nice rings, have the nice watch, have a beautiful woman on his arm, and show white authorities that I don't care. The KKK used to call him up and say, if you knock this white man out, we're gonna lynch you. He's like, it don't matter, I'm gonna knock him out. And so he did. Another funny story about Jack, one time, he was speeding in his race car. And this was back when only 20% of the population had a car to begin with. And so he was racing, and the white cop had pulled him over, and he said, listen, you're speeding, here's your $50 ticket. And Jack Johnson peels him off a crisp 100, and the cop was like, well, I can't give you change, it's only $50. And he said, Jack Johnson smiled at him, he said, listen, this is for when I come back. And so he drove off, right? And another one right here, I think this is really relevant. When he first won the title back in 1908, Jack Johnson was fighting Tommy Burns, and it was believed at the time that black men were like weak in the stomach. And so when he was fighting Tommy Burns, he was narrating the fight to him. He's like, hit me here, Tommy. And so he smashed him, and then he ate it, he laughed it off, and he hit him with a harder one, just to tell him like, hey, I'm not even worried about it. I'm blasé about what you're trying to give me. And so being really defiant, that was the new way for working class people, working class men, to defy white supremacy. Did you get to the next one for me? And so what I found doing all this research, besides what I said, is basically as time went on into the 30s and into the 40s, this idea of being like frivolous with your money was considered irresponsible. And so for Jack Johnson, he was really relegated to being like, oh, that's that old dude that he's crazy with it, because of all the pushback he had received from white supremacist forces And right here, this guy right here was Joe Louis, the second black heavyweight champion. He received better treatment because he was the opposite of Jack Johnson. Joe Louis, Jack Johnson, they kind of knew each other, but his manager, Joe Louis, was really about controlling the image of Joe Louis, saying you can't be with white women ever. You cannot be dressing all flashy. You cannot be disrespectful to white people. And so Joe Louis succeeded where Jack Johnson didn't. And could you get to the next slide for me? Like right here, he fought in World War II. Joe Louis, he fought in World War II. He was just a show pony, basically, just fighting for the troops. While Jack Johnson was old, of course, but Jack Johnson was really about, trying to rehabilitate his image as he grew older, trying to do sermons, raising a war bonds for the United States to become patriotic, because this new idea of appropriate blackness was to be patriotic, was to be subservient to white supremacist interests, and to not cause a ruckus, not to be with white women, not to be flashy, not to spend money. And what I found was what was really interesting within the next generation of fighters, we had Muhammad Ali, who really loved Jack Johnson. The moment that Muhammad Ali won the title in the 60s, I think it was 60, yeah. He was like, "Oh, I'm Jack Johnson, Ghost in the house, Jack Johnson." And he was referring to how Muhammad Ali received a lot of pushback from the white media, and he was basically saying, like, I am the new Jack Johnson, comparing himself to Jack Johnson. And often Muhammad Ali didn't really like Joe Louis. He felt like he was a Tom, as he would say. It's so interesting to see the generations have this different understanding of how to be appropriately black in a white supremacist society. And next slide for me. And yeah, all that to say, I read so many books. I can't even tell you. I can't even remember all of them. It was so crazy. Next one for me. Next one.
That's it.
Oh, and I forgot to say, I'm a boxer myself, so that's why I know all this stuff. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I had a question. You said you were a boxer yourself.
Mhm.
How do you see this research helping younger boxers in the gym now? How do you think this information might help them?
Ooh, I think it really highlights, like, the idea of gender being this sort of construct that we have to define and redefine. Like, it's just this idea that will change, and that, like, because jewelry back in those times was considered feminine. Mm-hmm. Like, for Jack Johnson to be having gold teeth, they're like, what the hell is wrong with this guy? Is this how, people thought they lambasted him for it in the white media, but like men were thinking, oh, that's the new thing. He looks sharp, he looks spiffy. So for newer, younger boxers like myself, it's really about understanding social constructs, but also how do they all interact to create this atmosphere of, like, if I do a certain action, will I get pushback? How come the pushback comes the way that it does? Like Muhammad Ali not wanting to fight in the war, it was considered unpatriotic because Joe Louis had started this idea of not being, like, pushing back against white authority figures. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. Yes.
Over the course of your research, how has your understanding of masculinity, from, like, your perspective, like, as a man, like, how has that evolved?
Wow, that's a good question. I never even asked that. This idea of, like, masculinity, what is it? It's like, it's so vacuous. Like, I'm like thinking about the Barbie movie, and I find it funny. I find it funny, this idea that, like, toughness and, like, eating a shot is considered tough, but, like, practicing or being thoughtful is, at this current moment, considered, like, feminine and not really reinforced. So for me, like, I gained a lot of respect for some of the folks who came before me, but also I gained a lot of respect for women. I mean, not to be all corny, and I'm serious. I'm dead serious. Like, this idea that you are placed into this box, it makes sense to me. I mean, I've being a sociologist nerd, I've intuitively understood this need to break from convention, from norms. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's just like, it really made everything clearer in my mind in terms of my own masculinity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm
curious, in your studies or just like your opinion, do you think that those like early expectations back in, you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, have they influenced and affected masculinity to this day, and particularly like black masculinity?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Like I pointed out, where he had the gold teeth. A lot of rappers have grills now. You know, they got diamonds and everything, studs. And even before Jack Johnson, he was called being a sporting man. You bet money, etc., etc. You were called a foppish dandy. That was like the British term. And so it's like adopting this archetype and then reimagining it in your own image. So does that answer your question? I forgot the question.
A little bit. It's also like curious about like how black masculinity and everything has changed over the years,
got you.
and from then to nowadays, where like we wouldn't think of like a super masculine black man as like maybe a boxer, but not like in that like foppish dandy, things like that. So like, do you think that there's still cultural influences from that all the way transferring to today?
Absolutely. Even Jack Johnson suits, myself included, this idea of drip, you know, that comes from the foppish dandy, from being a sporting man. You still see features of that today, even within the hip hop industry. This idea of luxury, of affluence, it still affects even today. It may not be suits now. It might be track suits and Gucci belts or whatever. We still see like artifacts of it today. Yes.
Have you read Gail Biederman's Loneliness and Civilization?
Yes, I have.
Okay, I was gonna say, if you haven't, you need to.
Yes, I
I'm
have.
thinking of like 100 different books that I can recommend to you on this,
Yeah.
but it's just interesting, like, gender and race is not solid and has never been solid and has
Exactly.
changed constantly over time, and they are used to define each other. Just wanted to recommend it.
You're good. You're good. I read too many books. I'm sorry. Yes.
I just wanted to give you a compliment. I think like academia doesn't really highlight fashion and appearance all that much, especially masculine appearance and fashion. So I just really appreciated that aspect and like your pictures and your presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
Just really had a question. Like you mentioned, like really the idea of appropriate blackness. You mentioned like really two different, figures with Jack Johnson and you said mentioned Tom. Right.
John Lewis.
Right. Yes.
John
And
Lewis,
the way they kind of like behave themselves in this idea of like white supremacy society. Do you think that kind of like created any like I don't know separation or categories between like people black people today? Like did that create like any like there's this group and there's this, did that create any separation in any ways from those two perspectives back in the day?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we see it in movies, like this idea. I think what's interesting now, like the black nerd stereotype, or the old school stereotype of like the black gangster, or all these different things interacting with each other, like the middle class versus working class perspective of blackness, and then having like a subcategory, like we're some old school anthropologists, like the bumps on the skull means da 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 da. There's so many different designations, etc., etc., and I find it very interesting to see some of these things play out over 100 years ago now. So it may not have been like directly correlative, but there are definitely some influences. If that answers your question, I forget the correlative, and then what's the other one? Say it again.
You said
Correlative, and then the opposite is quantitative. Yeah, there you go.
Correlative and causation.
Yeah. Causal. Nerd stuff. Sorry. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Any other questions? Yes.
It's just more a connection that I'm making. Well, I found it really interesting the way that you're talking about boxing, and then you also talked about like ideological fights as well between like Booker T. Washington and Du Bois as well, and then also how that continues to play in the media today, because you're talking about like assimilation versus confrontation, like those two different approaches to assimilate into whiteness or how to combat whiteness. And even like the Marvel movie Black Panther, like you have the original Black Panther who's like more peace, and then
Killmonger.
Killmonger who's more like aggressive and wants to like use violence to an extent. So like even those ideas are still continuing to be played out, whether we're like so conscious of it or not.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we fighting all day.
Yeah.
Every day. Yeah. I didn't even think about that, to be honest. I got punched in the head myself.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much.